Hey, I'm Cedric Chambers, and I would like to welcome you to another episode of the 3D Podcast, a masterclass where we share with you everything you need to know about how to transform diversity and inclusion in your organization as well as in your community. We're on a mission to amplify the voices of leaders that are making an impact in the world today so that we can have a better tomorrow. Our goal every episode is to keep it simple, honest, and transparent with you by uncovering the truths in diversity and inclusion with the hope of creating behavioral change, all while presenting it from a unique perspective. So look, if you're ready, get your notepad out, pour you a drink, and let's dive deep as we discuss the dimensions of diversity. Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of 3D Podcast where we speak to real practitioners that are making real change in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. Look, I'm excited for our show today as we are speaking to Nicole Herrera. Nicole has over 10 years of experience in tech and DE&I, and she currently leads diversity, equity, and inclusion for Android at Google. While at Google, Nicole has lived and worked in Argentina and Colombia and is an expert in go-to-market strategies for companies looking to expand their presence in Latin America. In addition to her work at Google, Nicole is the founder of Herrera, a training and consulting firm focused on helping companies improve their DE&I strategy with a particular focus on advancing women of color in tech. Look, I'm excited for this discussion and I hope you are too. So without further ado, let's jump into this discussion. So Nicole, thanks for joining us today on the 3D Podcast. Excited to have you here. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm really ready to dive into a good conversation today.
Likewise. So look, I'm excited, but for our listeners, right, I would love it, right? I gave a little bit of intro kind of background on you, but I would love it if you could just start us off by going a little bit over your background, telling us about your career journey, your story to how you got to today, and then we can dive deeper from there.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So a little bit about my background. I studied Latin American Studies at Wellesley College. So that is the degree I got for my undergrad. And that is really what kicked off the beginning of my career in Latin America. Mm-hmm. So I started my career with Google in Buenos Aires, Argentina, traveled a ton with Google and eventually ended up in Bogota, Colombia for a little while. So the first half of my career with Google was really in sales. And for a long time, I thought that was all I wanted to do. But slowly but surely, the universe started to push me in quite a different direction. And I'd say my first time really jumping into DEI work was actually working on ERG stuff for Google. And that's really what started to open the door of different opportunities for me to be looking at jobs in the DEI space. And I got the opportunity to lead our Latinx market outreach for our AdWords business and helped launch a program that's now called the Google Digital Coaches Program that works with Black and Latinx small business owners to help give them tools and resources to grow their business online. And then that slowly but surely led me to be working in DEI full time, which is what I do now for the Android business at Google. Mm-hmm. And my newest endeavor is I've actually launched my own personal brand that's called Herrera. And I do so for under that, I do speaking, consulting with the main focus on advancing women of color in the workplace.
Awesome. You moving. So let me ask you this. So I love the journey of your career. As you've navigated through, you've worked just in a variety of different places. You have a lot of different experiences. What do you think are like 2 or 3 of those kind of leadership principles that you've gained over this time, or principles that you've used to help continue to navigate your career?
I would say the first and foremost is tapping into your passion and really like leading with that and letting that be your North Star for like the career decisions that you're going to make. It's really easy, I think, in today's hustle and bustle to get caught up in like, oh, somebody else's version of what success looks like. And I think we get like almost obsessed with different ideas of things that we think we need to be doing or being in order to reach what success looks like. And we forget to just tap back into ourselves and our own inner voice and like, where is that leading me? What am I most passionate about? So I'd say that is the first piece. And then the second piece, I guess, is more personal to me and like what I am passionate about, which is like community driven work, equity focused work and social justice. And so that to me is what a true leader is working on, no matter what your day job is, finding time in your life to contribute to like making the world a better place and a fairer place.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. I love it. I love it. And so, I know that, as listeners are listening to this episode, everyone's at different points of their careers and they're just trying to, navigate themselves. And I love sharing and hearing other stories, right? Because there's always little nuggets that we can take out of it that can help us in our own. So I'm excited. And so, as we go deeper, right? Today, I'm excited about the topic because it is something that I would say most companies, many companies do something in, right? When it comes to diversity and inclusion, right? You say, hey, where do I start? Or where do a lot of organizations start? And one of those places are employee resource groups or business resource groups or affinity groups. There's so many names out there for these groups, but that's a place to where they start. And I'm excited to have this conversation because, that I think when we think about the purpose, when we think about how should we look at ERGs, kind of the overall, how do we use them in various different aspects of the business, it's a little bit unknown, right? Or people, I would say, don't dive as deep as they should into the topic. So I'm excited about the topic today. And so just so that our listeners kind of get their footing into kind of what it is that we're going to discuss, I want you to start with, what are ERGs, explain what they are, and then what's their purpose inside of an organization.
For sure. So ERGs stand for employee resource groups, and they're really self-led, employee-driven
Mm-hmm.
groups of people that come together based on either an identity that they share or also a shared lived experience, right? So, for example, I participate in Google's ERG for Latinx
Mm-hmm.
employees as well as the ERG for women employees. And there's pretty much employee resource groups for all types of identity groups. So we have, for Black employees, Native American employees, Indigenous employees, LGBTQ employees, among others.
Mm-hmm.
And the purpose of ERGs, I think it can vary a lot
Yeah.
based on the group. And I think that is the most important piece to really call out in this work is that ERGs are meant to be employee led and driven. And so, in that sense, they are by nature more of a grassroots, bottoms up, community led organization. And so, what that means is we need to let ERG leaders really shape the agenda, the
Mm-hmm.
objectives, and the goals. And it's really up to them to define what that looks like. And so, in my experience, I think most ERG's main focus is on providing a safe space and a community group for others who share your identity. And with that, often, shared challenges that you might be experiencing. So I think, especially for people who are historically underrepresented backgrounds, where you may really be the only one on your team or even at your
Yeah.
company, sometimes it can feel super important to find community in others that share your identity group and really find that safe space for you. And so, with that, I think a lot of these groups focus a lot on networking, different types of events to get to know one another, as well as raising awareness around their
Yeah.
group to the broader company, right? So, yeah, that's, I think, the main TLDR, as we say.
No, awesome, awesome. And so just taking that thought process, right? Employee led, really you think about networking, raising awareness, all of these things, right? When we look at ERGs traditionally, how have they been set up and used in organizations? So I kind of get an idea of, okay, this is what they should be doing, but how have they been traditionally being used inside of organizations, inside diversity and inclusion strategies? And what are some of the most common gaps that you see that's preventing these programs from being successful?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think it's important, especially in the DEI space, to really put context in place with a lot of these
Yep.
things because if with ERGs, it is like a buzz thing that is going on right now. But I think it's important to remember just like the context before we got to the place that we're in right
Yep.
now. And I would say that traditionally, ERGs have really been more independent
Mm.
organizations. And so they have not always necessarily been a part of the diversity and inclusion strategy at a lot of companies because of the fact that they are employee led and employee driven. So they haven't always been embedded into a company's DEI strategy or mapped back to companies like full-time DEI team. And that's because of what I talked about before, right? Like each group really kind of self-forms and defines its own structure. And then they would partner with different business areas as they saw like they had a certain need from a certain business. But now what we're seeing is that as companies start to invest more and more into DEI, we're really seeing a shift in that, and ERGs are becoming a very central part to a lot of companies' DEI strategy. Yep. And within that, it's becoming a pretty crucial, I think, work stream related back to like belonging and inclusion strategy. And we're seeing a lot of companies really using ERGs as a pulse on the ground, I think, to better understand the needs of different groups and see how they can support them. So I think depending on where different leaders or different companies are at on their journey, we still hear a lot of like, well, I don't know what people need to feel more included. I don't know what I should be doing to actually improve like the belonging experience of people that don't look like me. And so we see a lot of companies really relying more and more on ERGs to be that pulse and to kind of like be that informing arm to the business to surface different challenges they may be having and just like different pieces about their identity group.
Let me ask you this question. So what are if there are any indicators, if organization, let's say the organization currently has ERGs today, and what are some of those indicators that the ERG isn't like performing as it should, or we need to start to think about retooling the way that our ERGs operate, or at least provide assistance to the group? Like, what are some of those indicators so that as leaders are looking at their ERGs and the performance of them, are there any kind of indicators that help them say, okay, this is something that we really need to address, or the ERGs may be going down the wrong path and we need to refocus?
I think companies shouldn't be waiting for that moment to happen is what my advice would be. If you have an ERG, you need to be thinking about how you are going to support and amplify the group. So my advice would be don't sit and wait on that. If you have groups that are starting to form, if they've existed for a while, it's probably about time like you should check in with them and think about the best things that you can put in place to support them. I would say we can talk a little bit about kind of like some of the gaps and problems that I tend to see with ERG work. I think the first is it is a fine line between companies supporting ERGs versus trying to enforce a company-led top-down strategy on the ERG. So, one of the things that we talk about is nothing about us without us, right? So don't put a strategy together without somebody that looks like, without somebody that looks like me at the table, because these are people who have lived experience in their identity. You need to be letting them lead like what it is that their group needs versus having a company enforced strategy. It's their job to advocate to the company about it, and then the company's job to solve for it, not vice versa. Because what we see happen in the inverse is that we often get a lot of performative stuff that's being dictated to the ERG, that they need to be producing this amount of events or become the person who's going to now recruit everybody that looks like them for the company. And that's not what an ERG is for. And that starts to become like a more harmful, problematic space, actually. The second mistake I think we see very often is companies are relying too heavily on ERGs as their only strategy for driving more inclusion and belonging. It's definitely part of the recipe when it's done right, but it can't be your whole thing or even your half thing, I would say, because you're then putting the burden on people who are raising their hand to say that it's not an inclusive place and I'm from an underrepresented group, to be the one responsible to make your company more inclusive for themselves or more equitable or more diverse. So again, that's just like perpetuating the problem. And then kind of along those lines, we often see these groups heavily under-resourced in all kind of aspects of what it means to resource a group. And so there's not always equitable funds that get allocated for the work to get done provided by the company. So if you're coming in and saying, hey, I need you to do this amount of recruiting, or we need this ERG to like really be our voice around this space in whatever that looks
Yep.
like. Well, you need to fund what that work is going to look like by investing in whatever that is, and also paying people to do this work, because this should not be unpaid work at an organization. It's people going above and beyond what they've been hired to do. And then lastly, I think another space that does not get enough airtime, it's starting to get more airtime, is resourcing around mental health support in this space and well-being in this space. Because when people are raising their hand to do this, again, like I said, on top of their job, at some point they're going to experience fatigue.
Yeah.
At some point they're going to experience burnout. And given the nature of a lot of topics that might come up and just like things that are happening in the world for different groups, there's a lot of trauma that can happen that comes along with doing this work, or can be brought up or triggered by something that people are working on. And I don't see enough companies investing in like that mental health support for the leaders who are doing this in a lot of their time. So, and then the last piece of under-resourced is ERG leaders are often not recognized enough for the work that they're doing in their performance reviews. Like, this work should be what is a standout example that leads to a promotion, right? Like this for some people, you know, this is the equivalent of like leading a large sized organization on a global scale. You're putting together a leadership structure, you've got committees, you maybe have chapters all over the world. There's a ton of impact that's coming out of it. And I don't see a lot of companies putting like an equitable process in place to make sure that this work gets fairly recognized in performance reviews.
Wow. That was a lot. And as you were going through, I was thinking to myself in like past companies, I was like, yep, seen that one. Yep, seen that one. Yep. I'm just checking them off in my head. Like, some people just need to like scrap and start start over.
It does feel like that sometimes.
Oh man,
Yeah.
I think the biggest ones, you know, and this is what I've seen, but you know, the biggest ones is that I've seen, and kind of piggybacking off a little bit what you said, is that the one is the workload, right? And I think that we come in with the best intentions that, look, we're going to have this executive board, we're going to have people in the organization helping, but then we find out that, you know, it all lies on like few people to get a lot of work done, right? Because, you know, everyone else is going back to doing their day jobs, and they put their job in front of the ERG, but then the leaders of that group feel that responsibility, right, to pick up the slack and to do what they can do to make it move forward. Which ultimately, I love the aspect of mental health, because there's like serious, not only like burnout that's related to it, but, you know, you think about an event happens in society, right? And then now, you know, the company is looking at how the ERG will address, right? Whether that's George Floyd, whether that's, you know, any event that's happening, how is the ERG going to address it? Not thinking through the individual and what are they going through, right? And what do they have to deal with and process before they can even like start to communicate this or lead an organization? Because depending on how big your team is, I mean, ERGs for all intents and purposes are separate. They're organizations, right? Which with a structure, with leadership team. I mean, so you're a mini CEO. Let me ask you this. How have you seen the pay aspect work? Because I fully believe the ERG leaders should get some type of compensation, because this is above and beyond your job. What are some of the common forms or ways that you've seen company address it?
I'd say that we're at the very beginning of that conversation for most organizations. I haven't seen a lot of companies put this into play yet. I think it's like in the conversational stage. And so then what we see end up happening is now it's another thing for ERG leaders to do. It's like, okay, hey, can you put that business proposal together and like do the math on what this should look like, versus somebody from the actual compensation team in HR kind of coming up with what fair pay for this should look like. I think a common thing that we see is, you know, an annual award that somebody might get for the leadership that they do in ERG work, or some type of like extra bonus that gets thrown on for like a big event that somebody maybe put on. And so what that actually ends up leading to is deeper inequity. It's really sad, and I hate to call it that, but it's what we see happening, because when you leave it up to somebody's individual choice or individual whatever, that's when bias comes out, and not everybody is going to get recognized equitably, even within the same ERG group, right? And so that is why it's so important to think about these things from like that systemic process place. And then the other piece with what you were mentioning, like with the mental health side and relying on ERGs in moments like when George Floyd is happening. And what happens is you can't rely on the ERG to keep this at the front and center of the conversation. Correct. Like you can't be relying on the ERG to be the one saying this needs to be the priority, this needs to be the priority, this needs to be the priority. And we get what is really like this white urgency and this white guilt that starts to come out. And that becomes like the main driver of how people are leading in their decision making without really taking a beat and saying, okay, what, maybe I have good intentions, but what's the actual impact that's going to come out of this? And like, am I potentially actually going to be causing more harm to people who are already like experiencing something that I can't even relate to right now? And so I think that's a really important principle in DEI work. We talk about first, do no harm, and leading with that in mind and making sure that you're thinking through like, what are all the potential outcomes, even in like the best intention and best case scenario, where you could actually be perpetuating more harm with something that you're trying to do or stand up with these groups.
Nice. I mean, there's just to understand, I mean, for folks listening, right? I think this is something just to start to get your mind thinking about, how can we approach this differently, right? I don't, and I get your advice. So you tell me what you think. Something just popped in my head around just like, doing like, I wouldn't necessarily say time studies, but like in the beginning, seeing, have folks track their time and see how much they're actually working on the ERG so we can understand, out of a 40-hour week, how much time is being taken up, right? And then, ask not necessarily the exact times, but is it happening in the evening time, early in the morning before work? Because, even when you have ERGs, right, and you're leading them, their manager, that's actually the work that they have to do, their manager still is looking like the work comes first, right, at the end of the day. So they're looking like, how many times can I go to my manager and say I'm late because I had to do a event, or I had to do something else. And so like, even communicating how, the people who are leading involved heavily, even communicating with their team, with their managers, from a leadership, from an organization perspective, what is the expectation of ERG leaders, right? Because there needs to be some give and take, because we don't want people to be, staying up to 2-3 in the morning trying to get things done for the ERG, because between 8 to 5, they're focused on their day job and they just don't have time to do it. And so we need to kind of have that conversation, right, too, as far as from a leadership perspective, setting the tone for how to operate in this space. And so from your perspective, knowing that we've talked through some gaps, we've talked through, what are some of those things that we see as challenges for those leaders, how can we leverage ERG so that they can be more impactful? So we know the gaps, but now what can we do and how can we leverage them so that we can actually get, great outcomes out of our ERGs inside of these organizations?
So I think what companies should be setting goals around are really, how am I empowering, uplifting, and amplifying the work that ERGs are doing, which is really like a shift in that mindset that I was talking about, versus like relying on them to be the driver of inclusion and belonging. It's like, okay, if this is what these teams are defining that needs to be front and center, what am I now going to do as a company to make sure that there's going to be accountability in place and resources in place to act on the needs that ERGs are surfacing? And so some of the most effective and impactful ERG leaders that I have seen is when they shift into this mindset of influencing and advocating. They are no longer the owners responsible to get all of that work done, because there's just no way, right? Like how you're talking about with the time, where am I going to keep coming up with the time to do all these extra jobs? I think an example to make it more tangible for people is, let's just say like a company is lacking a Spanish language strategy for a certain product, for example. The most effective ERG will advocate for the company to allocate the resources that are needed to take that work on. The most ineffective ERGs are the ones that are going to raise their hand and say, okay, let me translate everything that needs to get translated for you to be able to launch this product now in
Yeah.
Spanish. That's not sustainable. That's not equitable for anyone
Yeah.
involved. And I see that happening a lot on small scale and large scale with different things. And I think it's a double-edged sword, because people who are from underrepresented groups, and I'm sure you can relate to this, we often feel a very personal, deeply personal responsibility when we see or recognize unfairness or inequity or
Yeah.
a lack of inclusion to be the one to fix it and raise our hand and help make it better. But we can't be the only ones that are doing that. And so that is why I think, like I said, the most effective ERG leaders are shifting into this space of like advocates and influencers at the company. And what that means is companies need to be investing in training for those skill sets for these leaders to be able to flush out and develop those skill sets, because you're going to be talking very likely with like senior people within your organization. You might not even have experience ever doing that or pushing proposals forward. And so it'd be great to see more companies kind of investing in that along the lines of what I mentioned before, of like that empowering and uplifting
Mm-hmm.
space to really make it more effective and impactful.
No, awesome. Let me ask you, do you, what's your thoughts on like ERG leaders, that being actually defined as like 50% of their actual job, right? What's your thoughts there versus like, hey, you have 100% of this job and I need you to add on, the ERG stuff, right? What do you think about like, as organizations, and I'm just, talking to the listeners here, as we're thinking through other ways in which we can approach it, or even things that we should try out, right, that just haven't traditionally been tried. What's your thoughts on creating some type of structure or model like that? Or is there another structure that you would, say, hey, let's test it out. It might not work. It might work, but this is something that can give us some data that can help us decide kind of what's the right path to go down for our organization.
I really like that idea. I think people would probably be really excited about that, and more excited than they are right now, because there's no air coverage for
Yeah.
people, like how you were saying. And then what happens is it really does end up depending on your manager and what their expectation is
Mm.
of you. And even if there are company wide goals around this that are saying ERGs are important and we need to focus on inclusion and belonging, that doesn't always have a trickle down effect to every
Yeah.
person's individual manager. Like, not every individual manager is okay with people spending time doing this work. And so,
Yes.
like you said, what happens then is people are doing it at late hours or early hours and like scrapping to get two jobs done. So I really like that idea. I think it would be really interesting to model out. I think people would get more excited than they are already about working on this
Yeah.
stuff if they had more of that air coverage to do it.
Awesome. Well, you heard it here, everybody. So go try it. And then Nicole co-signed on it. And so tag both of us.
But don't blame us if it goes wrong. Don't blame
But
us.
if it goes right, tag us and say you got the idea from here. So no, this is awesome. So kind of, wrapping up a little bit here, for those that are listening, for practitioners that are out there, and when we think about the 3D podcast, it's really about how are we going to change behaviors and actually go out and take actions in that third dimension. And so for the practitioners that are listening, what are 2 to 3 things that, once they hit stop, which you don't have to hit stop, you just go to the next episode. But after they hit stop from this podcast, from this episode, what are 2 to 3 things that they can do tomorrow that'll help them get on the right track, to starting to have, a more successful ERG program?
I think the first piece is asking for leadership development
Mm-hmm.
training. If you feel like I need help to become a better advocate, so I stop falling into this
Mm-hmm.
trap of doing all the work and trying to do all the things, ask for help, ask for those resources, ask for whatever leadership development training that you and your fellow ERG leaders need to become better advocates. So that's my number one advice to, I think, anyone who's listening in, who's already like in this
Mm-hmm.
space and feeling that burnout. And then the second piece of advice is more so for like those HR folks who are listening in. I think everybody needs to be looking at those processes and systems that are in place and creating an equitable process, like we talked about, to allocate budget and compensation to the ERG leaders at their company, and that process to ensure that equitable recognition of the work is going to happen in performance reviews. And then don't forget about it. You need to audit those processes that get put in place to make sure that they're actually happening consistently across the company. So those are some big things. They're not easy things
Yeah.
to stand up, but ERGs aren't going away anytime soon. And so you want to make sure you're doing it right and supporting these people and their voices and making sure that they're getting the right visibility and the right resources.
No, this is awesome. You look, they're not going anywhere. More and more companies are still seeing ERGs as the first kind of step for them in this space when they're launching their DNI programs, DEI programs. And so, it makes more sense to get it right. And so, if anybody is, like I said, trying any of these things, or if you just have something different that has worked, right? I would love to just hear it. You can comment, and share and let us know so that we can also use this in our world. And so, I want to make sure that we tackle this. And so, I know that, you're working in the DE&I space, but can you tell us a little bit about kind of your organization, your company, and kind of what you're doing, right, as a founder in entrepreneur space, and kind of how is that going thus far?
I'm so excited about it. I feel like it's been really amazing and just like personally
Mm-hmm.
rewarding. And so my other big piece of advice to those listening in is to invest in yourself.
Bingo.
Invest in
Yep.
yourself before investing in anything or anyone else. You need to be investing in yourself. And that is really what I did. And that's why I made the decision to launch the company and my personal brand. And it has just been like the most
Yeah.
rewarding thing. And when you work on something that you are truly passionate about and it's aligned with like your goals and all of these things, you would be shocked how quickly opportunities start to open up for you.
Yeah.
And the universe is just like sending you those constant signs of reinforcement that this is like where you are meant to be and what you are meant to be
Yep.
doing. I'm sure you can relate to that a ton with your work as well. And so right now I'm focused on just like getting my name out
Mm-hmm.
there and continuing to open up different opportunities for speaking at different organizations and conferences. There's a ton of work that's going on, in the DEI space right
Yep.
now. And my focus is on making sure that that work gets done right and that the right people have a voice in those conversations and at that. And then I also do consulting work with different organizations who are looking for help and don't necessarily have the in-house
Yep.
resources to be building out their strategy or shaping like what they should be
Yeah.
doing. And then lastly, I also do workshops with different people, particularly women and people of color who are like looking to get more into this
Mm-hmm.
space and become that better advocate for themselves at their company, or think about different ways that they can actually turn their identity into like strength that should be marketed and valued on their resume. So I do a lot of work with students and early career folks who are looking to like dabble more into that space and develop out that skill set.
Oh, I love it. You can hear it. You can hear the passion, right? And the law of attraction, right? You look. This is one of those things to where, look, once you get into it, if this is your passion, this is what you want to do, and you love doing it, it's amazing how things align and they come together, right, to help you work out what it is you're trying to work out. And so I can see it in you, and I can see, how much you're loving this. And I think that, I know for me, it was the same way, right? It was like I didn't know how everything was going to happen, but it lined up and it happened. So no, this is exciting. And if people want to get more about kind of you and the organization, or, your services, where can they go to find out more information?
You can find me on Instagram at it's.herera, Herera. And my website is www.her-era.co.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. And so I love to tackle this, and we're also going to link the website in the description. So if you need it, everybody go click on it and go to it. But I love to end the conversation off with, when you think about the impact that we're trying to make and the impact that you're trying to make. Uh, I love this. I always think about legacy, and I think about, in order for us to have and leave a legacy, it's something that we work on now, right? So that we can make sure that we're doing the things that we need to do to leave the legacy that we want to leave. And so when I think about legacy, what I would like for you to do, one of these exercises, is in 25 words or less, what is your leadership legacy statement? And I want you to think about this in reference to if someone meets you one time or they meet Nicole 10 times, right? Everyone ideally is going to have something similar to say, right? And, whether, whatever that may be about you. And I want to know, right, when I ask somebody about you, when I go have that conversation, tell me a little bit about Nicole. What's your experience like? What's that legacy that you're leaving behind?
I think my legacy and what I hope people will say when speaking to others about me is that Nicole is a game
Mm,
changer and an advocate, really working to make more space for women of
yep.
color and make the world a fairer and a better place.
There you go. There you go. I love it. I love it. I love it. Well, look, this has been an amazing conversation. Before we go, do you have any shout outs, any parting words, anything else for the audience? And then, you gave out your Instagram, but is there anywhere else that they can connect with you and find you to further the discussion?
You can find me on LinkedIn. I'd love to stay in touch. Please reach out. I hope anything that we talked about today inspired you to go out there and invest in yourself and be your own advocate.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. Well, look, that does it for us. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on another episode of 3D Podcast. This is Cedric, and you've been listening to Nicole, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Leader at Android, as well as the founder, CEO, chief head of everything there is to do with her era. Look, go check her out. Go look at, the company information. Look, we want to make sure that we get the word out and just share. And if you have any comments about the show, no matter what it is, share it with us. We love to have the discussion. Thanks, Nicole.
Thank you so much.